Audiobooks offer a unique way to experience literature, making stories accessible to a wider audience.
Welcome to the South African Journey audiobook series. We're glad to have you with us. We hope this work.
Today on the show, we're diving into the world of economic indicators. These are the numbers that tell us how the economy is doing. Things like GDP, unemployment rates, and consumer confidence. But what do these indicators really mean? How are they calculated? And how should we interpret them? We'll break it all down for you, with the help of some experts to make sense of the numbers that shape our world. Chapter 1. The First Steps. Early Hominids and the Struggle for Survival. Story of humanity begins not with kings or monuments, but with fragile beings walking upright for the first time under the African sun. Long before pyramids, long before writing, long before cities, our ancestors were simply survivors. The cradle of humanity, in the valleys and savannas of Africa, archaeologists have uncovered traces of our earliest kin. Australopithecus africanus, discovered in South Africa, stood upright more than 2 million years ago. These beings were small, their brains little larger than apes, yet they marked the turning point, the shift from animal instinct to human possibility. Africa was not primitive. It was primary. The soil of Africa bore the first footprints of upright beings, and from these steps, the long march of humanity began. Tools. Small stones, great futures. The first tools were not elaborate. Simple flakes of stone, sharp enough to cut meat or scrape. Hides were fashioned by Homo habilis, the handyman. A broken rock may seem insignificant, but with each strike against bone or wood, knowledge accumulated. One stone became many, one technique repeated became tradition, and soon tool-making, spread across groups and generations. The compound effect was at work. Small acts of learning multiplied into culture. Fire, the first multiplier at first, fire was feared. Lightning strikes and wildfires terrified early humans. But at some point, around 1 million years ago, our ancestors began to keep fire, to guard it, to feed it. The change was revolutionary. Fire meant warmth against the cold, protection from predators, light in the darkness, and most importantly, cooked food. Cooking unlocked nutrients, shrinking digestion, but growing brains. The compound effect turned fire from fear into foundation, shaping human development for millennia. Fear and survival. Fragility becomes strength. Early humans lived on the edge of fear. Surrounded by stronger predators, lions, leopards, hyenas, they were vulnerable. But fear, compounded with creativity, became adaptation. They learned to band together, to signal danger, to share food. Each small cooperation added to group. Survival. What began as fragile individuals became resilient communities. Vulnerability itself, multiplied across generations, became strength. Language, from gesture to memory. Before words, there were gestures and sounds, grunts, cries, hand signals. But as these repeated, they gained shared meaning. One gesture became many, one sound became language. With language, knowledge could be stored outside the body, in memory shared between people. Lessons learned by one generation could be passed to the next. The compound effect made memory communal, ensuring that survival skills multiplied instead of perished. Conclusion: Africa's first gift. The first steps of humanity were small: stones, fires, signals, fears. But they were compounded into tools, culture, language, and cooperation. Africa gave humanity its first gift: the slow patience of survival. The small acts that multiplied into civilization's foundation. Humanity's story begins not in grandeur, but in fragility. And it is precisely this fragility, repeated and refined, that became the strength of a species. Chapter 2. From savanna to settlement, farming, families, and the birth of culture, humanity did not remain forever wandering. Slowly, steadily, the patterns of survival shifted. From hunting and gathering came farming and herding. From temporary shelters came villages. From scattered groups came families bound in shared identity. The compound effect was at work again, turning small, repeated acts into the structures of culture. The long age of gathering. For most of human history, survival meant movement. Early humans gathered fruits, nuts, and roots. They hunted with spears and traps. Life was fragile, but the rhythm of gathering shaped patience. This nomadic life required cooperation. One person alone could not survive, but together, groups shared. Knowledge of plants, paths, and seasons. Oral tradition was born around campfires. This berry is safe. That animal is dangerous. Each small observation, passed on, multiplied survival for generations. The agricultural turnaround. 10,000 years ago, a slow revolution began. In fertile parts of Africa, the Nile Valley, the Sahel, and later across the continent, humans began to plant seeds deliberately. They learned to herd goats, cattle, and sheep. What began as experiment became habit, and habit became foundation. Farming replaced wandering, and with it came stability. Repetition created surplus, surplus created security, and security created growth. The compound effect here was monumental. The daily act of planting and harvesting transformed humanity from restless gatherers into settled builders, families, and kinship. With settlement came family structure. Children no longer grew in constant movement but in stable environments. Kinship groups became extended families, families became clans, and clans became tribes. The smallest bond, the bond of parent and child, was repeated, multiplied, and ritualized until it became the foundation of society. Identity was no longer only about survival, it was about belonging. The birth of culture is repetition elevated into meaning. Songs were sung to teach and remember. Stories were told to explain the world. Rituals marked the cycles of life, birth, death, harvest, rain. Drums made. From animal hide repeated rhythms until they became music. Paintings on rock walls, once simple marks, became storytelling art. Burial practices, repeated, became religion's earliest steps. Culture was not created in a single moment of inspiration. It was the compound effect of daily practices, rituals, and memories layered across centuries. Settlements, the first villages. Small farms grew into permanent villages. Clay huts, granaries, and fire pits were built and rebuilt each season. One hut became many. One path became streets. One family became community. The rhythm of planting, harvesting, and storing food created the rhythm of settlement. The compound, effective stability laid the groundwork for later civilizations. Conclusion: from fragile steps to stable ground, the journey from savanna to settlement was slow, uneven, and fragile. Yet it changed everything. Humanity's scattered survival became rooted community. Daily acts, planting seeds, herding animals, telling stories, compounded into the birth of farming, family, and culture. Africa once again showed its role as the primary base where the first villages were planted, the first cultures took shape, and the long arc toward civilization began. Chapter 3: Memory and Story, Humanity's First Library. Around the fire, before scrolls and books, before alphabets and libraries, humanity preserved its wisdom in the oldest vessel of all, the spoken word. Around the glow of the fire, after the day's hunting and gathering, our ancestors told stories. In these stories, memory was stored, lessons were passed down, and culture took shape. The compound effect was alive here too. Each story told once was fragile, but told again and again, it became immortal. The fire as classroom night fell heavy on the savannah. Predators lurked and movement ceased, but fire created a circle of safety, warmth, and light. Within that circle, language flourished. Parents taught children through tales, elders instructed youth, and myths explained the mysteries of the world. Every night of storytelling was like another page written in humanity's first library, each retelling compounded memory, shaping identity and continuity across generations. From gesture to myth at first, memory was simple, pointing out danger, mimicking animal cries, warning of poisonous plants. But repetition gave rise to pattern, and pattern gave rise to myth. The story of the hunt became ritualized, retold with gestures and rhythm. The memory of a great flood or storm became legend, passed across centuries. The spirits of ancestors were remembered through chants, keeping the dead alive in the living. Each retelling added layers, compounding raw experience into shared worldview. Proverbs: wisdom in small doses. Proverbs emerged as condensed wisdom, easy to repeat and hard to forget. Short sayings, sharpened by time, became carriers of truth. Little by little, the bird builds its nest. Drop by drop, a river is made. Each proverb was a seed of memory, planted in minds and repeated until it became cultural inheritance. Proverbs are the fingerprints of the compound effect, small phrases multiplied into lifetimes of guidance. Ritual, memory made visible. Storytelling did not remain in words alone. Ritual was born as memory acted out. Dances repeated the rhythms of the hunt. Masks and carvings embodied spirits and ancestors. Seasonal ceremonies encoded the timing of rains, planting, and harvest. Ritual was repetition turned into sacred. Memory. Each act performed year after year compounded into tradition, and tradition into identity. The first library. There were no shelves, no scrolls, no ink. Yet humanity had a library, the collective memory carried in stories, songs, and rituals. Every fire was a classroom, every elder a librarian, every child a reader of spoken wisdom. This oral library was resilient. Even without writing, knowledge survived. The compound effect of daily storytelling ensured that memory was not lost, but multiplied. Chapter 4. Civilizations as layers. From villages to kingdoms, from stone to monument, from ritual to law, civilization did not arrive with a trumpet blast. It emerged slowly, like dawn across the horizon, layer upon layer, built on the compounding of earlier steps. Villages became towns, towns became cities, cities became kingdoms, stone walls became monuments, rituals became laws. What we now call civilization was not a sudden leap, but a compounded inheritance of patient generations. From village to city, when farming stabilized food supplies, villages could grow larger. More people meant more needs, and more needs meant more organization. A surplus of grain required storage. Storage required guards. Guards required rules. Over time, these simple structures layered upon one another. One farmer's field joined another's. One family's hut stood beside another's. Cooperation compounded until communities grew into towns and cities. Civilization was not invented, it was accumulated. From stone to monument stone was first a tool, then a shelter. But soon, it became something more, a marker of memory, a monument to meaning. In Egypt, simple tombs compounded over centuries into pyramids. In Mesopotamia, mud brick shrines compounded into ziggurats. In Africa, stone walls at Great Zimbabwe compounded into citadels. Each layer was built on the last. What began as necessity grew into beauty and power. Monuments were not sudden marvels. They were the compound effect carved in stone. From ritual to law at first, rituals governed life. Seasonal festivals, sacrifices, dances. But as societies grew, ritual hardened into law. Rules about food, marriage, and inheritance were repeated until they became codes. Elders and chiefs, once guides of memory, became judges of disputes. What was once unwritten custom was etched into stone tablets or clay. Law was memory formalized, culture compounded into authority. Civilization as a layered inheritance. Every civilization was not a fresh creation, but a layer upon earlier layers. Egypt rose upon the Nile's fertility, repeating the rhythm of floods and harvests until they became calendar and kingdom. Mesopotamia rose between rivers, where irrigation compounded into trade, writing, and empires. Greece and Rome layered philosophy and politics upon Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and African foundations. African kingdoms like Nubia and Ethiopia layered trade, religion, and artistry onto the primary base of the continent. No civilization stood alone. Each was a compounded inheritance, a mosaic of earlier acts. The forgotten hands, it is easy to remember kings, pharaohs, emperors, but the real builders of civilization were the countless unnamed. Farmers, potters, scribes, stonemasons, mothers, storytellers. Their daily work, repeated across lifetimes, created the layers of society. Civilization is not the work of sudden genius, but of millions of invisible hands. Their compounding effort is the true architecture of history. Conclusion: the patience of civilization. Civilizations are slow miracles. They are not conjured by one leader or one generation, but layered across centuries. Villages into towns, towns into cities, rituals into laws, stones into monuments. The story of civilization is the story of the compound effect at its grandest scale. It reminds us that nothing begins finished, nothing begins great. Greatness is the harvest of patience, repetition, and time. Chapter 5. Africa's Echo, Ethiopia, Nubia, Great Zimbabwe, and the compounded genius of overlooked civilizations. Too often, the story of civilization is told as if Africa was only its cradle and then stepped aside while greatness unfolded elsewhere. But this is a distortion. Africa was not only the primary base of humanity, it was also the soil where kingdoms, cities, and cultures flourished in echoes that still reverberate. Ethiopia, Nubia, Great Zimbabwe, and many others testify that the compound effect of human development did not leave Africa behind. It grew ever stronger. Nubia. The southern kingdoms south of Egypt along the Nile lay Nubia. For centuries, it was Egypt's neighbor, rival, and sometimes ruler. The Nubians mastered ironworking, trade, and monumental architecture. Their city of Meroe became a center of learning and industry, producing tools and weapons that spread across Africa. Nubian queens, the Kandakes, commanded armies and diplomacy, compounding influence across generations. Pyramids dotted the Nubian landscape, smaller than Egypt's but more numerous, each a stone echo of compounded tradition. Nubia reminds us that civilization was not an Egyptian monopoly. Africa's Nile carried greatness both north and south. Ethiopia, the High. Kingdom high in the mountains of East Africa, Ethiopia became one of the world's most enduring civilizations. Its roots stretch back to the kingdom of Aksum, 1st to 7th centuries CE, a power of trade, coinage, and writing. Aksum's stelae, towering stone monuments, were marvels of engineering, built stone by stone into skyward symbols. Ethiopian, Saint. Scribes preserved scriptures in Ge'ez, one of the world's oldest written languages still alive in liturgy today. The Ethiopian Church, one of Christianity's earliest strongholds, compounded faith across centuries, surviving invasions and isolation. Ethiopia proves that Africa was not merely influenced by outside powers. It was itself a source of continuity, resilience, and creativity. Great Zimbabwe, the stone city in southern Africa, between the 11th and 15th centuries, rose Great Zimbabwe. Here, massive stone walls, built without mortar, formed a city of trade and culture. The great enclosure, with its towering walls, was built stone by stone, layer by layer, a compounding of skill and design. Trade networks reached across the Indian Ocean, linking southern Africa with Arabia, India, and China. Gold, ivory, and iron flowed outward. Glass beads and ceramics flowed inward. The very name Zimbabwe means stone houses, an echo of endurance. Great Zimbabwe is a reminder that Africa produced its own monuments of ingenuity, not copies, but original achievements born of compounding tradition. The overlooked genius. Why? Are these African civilizations so often overlooked in world history? Colonial narratives, prejudice, and distortion compounded over centuries to hide Africa's achievements. But archaeology, anthropology, and memory are restoring the truth. Africa was not passive, it was active, creative, and foundational. The law of compounding applies here too. Just as small acts build greatness, repeated neglect erases memory. Yet truth, once uncovered, compounds again, restoring dignity to a continent's history. Africa's echo in the world, African civilizations were not isolated. They echoed outward. Nubian iron spread across trade routes. Ethiopian Christianity preserved ancient traditions that influenced Europe and the Middle East. Great Zimbabwe's trade connected continents, proving Africa was part of global exchange long before colonialism. Africa's story is not one of silence, but of resonance, of voices compounded into the song of civilization. Conclusion: the continuity of greatness. From Nubia's pyramids to Ethiopia's scriptures, from Zimbabwe's stone walls to countless other kingdoms, Africa's civilizations testify to the compound effect of human genius. They show that greatness is not a single flame, but a fire carried forward, generation to generation. Africa was not only the cradle, it was also the echo, the rhythm, the pulse of civilization itself. And those echoes remind us the story of humanity. is incomplete until Africa's compounded genius is honored. Part Nassau. Outward flow of civilization. Humanity did not remain rooted only in its birthplace. From Africa, waves of people carried tools, language, and memory outward across rivers, deserts, and seas. Each step outward was a layer added to the story, each migration a multiplier of culture. The compound effect worked here too. One small group leaving, repeated over centuries, populated the earth. Civilization, therefore, is not the story of one region, but of many branches growing from a single root. Chapter 6. Crossing Rivers and Deserts. Humanity migrates beyond Africa. The great migrations of Homo erectus and later Homo sapiens from Africa into Asia, Europe, and beyond. Crossing deserts, mountains, and ice. Small steps compounded into global spread. Knowledge carried outward. Fire, tools, early rituals. Chapter 7. Asia, the first great civilizations. Mesopotamia, rivers, farming, and writing as compounding inventions. Indus Valley, cities, trade, and systems of order. China, dynasties, philosophy, and invention as compounded continuity. Chapter 8. Europe, the layering of ideas. Greece, philosophy, democracy, art, built from compounded African and Asian roots. Rome, law, engineering, empire, compounding order into vastness. The blending of Africa, Asia, and Europe into shared civilization. Chapter 6. Crossing Rivers and Deserts. Humanity migrates beyond Africa. The story of humanity is the story of walking. From the very beginning, humans have been restless travelers. They left the cradle of Africa step by step, crossing rivers, deserts, and mountains. No one journey was sudden or grand, but repeated over generations, these steps compounded into the global spread of our species. The first migrants' archaeology tells us that Homo erectus began leaving Africa nearly 2 million years ago. Later, around 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors, followed, moving gradually into Asia, Europe, and beyond. They did not move in crowds or armies, but in small bands of families. Each group carried with them fire, tools, language, and memory. Each small migration compounded with others, until humanity's footprint reached every continent except Antarctica. Crossing deserts and rivers Africa is encircled by formidable barriers. Deserts to the north, rivers to the east, oceans on every side. Yet slowly, humans found paths through. They crossed the Sinai Peninsula into the Middle East. They followed rivers into the fertile lands of Mesopotamia and India. They walked along coastlines, where water and food made survival possible. One step by itself was nothing, but thousands of steps, repeated over generations, carried humans out of Africa and across the world. The compound effect turned fragile. Wanderers into global settlers, adapting to new worlds. Every new land required new adaptations. In colder climates, humans learned to stitch animal skins for warmth. In forested lands, they carved canoes and learned to fish. On grassy plains, they domesticated animals and followed herds. Each new adaptation was added to the inheritance of humanity. Skills learned in one region were carried to the next, compounding knowledge across continents. Memory as luggage. What did humans carry with them? Not gold or monuments, but memory. Oral traditions, stories, and rituals were the true luggage of migration. Fire-making, tool-making, songs of the hunt, all were repeated and compounded as families moved outward. Civilization was not invented anew in each region. It was transplanted, adapted, and layered upon African foundations. The spread of humanity into Asia, where fertile valleys would give rise to Mesopotamia, India, and China. Into Europe, where adaptation to harsh winters would shape resilience and innovation. Into Oceania, where canoes and seafaring skills compounded into exploration of vast waters. Into the Americas, where humans crossed icy land bridges and carried knowledge into new continents. The migration out of Africa was not a single event, but a slow cascade, repeated until the globe was filled. The law at work, the outward spread of humanity is one of history's greatest proofs of the compound effect. One family's migration seems small, but repeated over thousands of years, it becomes the peopling of the earth. One adaptation, fire, tools, clothing, seems simple but repeated and layered. It becomes culture. Civilization itself rests on this law, the patient accumulation of small steps multiplied across generations. Conclusion: from primary to global, Africa was the primary base. From there, humanity walked outward, carrying seeds of survival, memory, and culture. The compounding of migration turned a local story into a global one. The rivers and deserts that once seemed barriers became pathways. The small steps of fragile beings became the long stride of a species destined to shape the world. Chapter 7: Asia, the first great civilizations. When humanity's migrations carried families out of Africa into new lands, they brought with them tools, fire, and memory. In Asia, these seeds of survival found fertile ground. Rivers swelled with life, valleys offered abundance, and communities grew into civilizations. Here, compounding revealed its grandeur. Small farming villages became vast empires, repeated. Rituals became religions, and daily survival became culture that would shape the world. Mesopotamia, between two rivers, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, farming communities slowly multiplied into cities. Each season of planting taught new lessons. Each generation refined irrigation, building canals that turned deserts into breadbaskets. Clay tokens for counting sheep compounded into cuneiform writing. Shared harvests and surplus grain compounded into temples, trade, and kingship. Repeated disputes, solved by elders, compounded into the world's first written laws under Hammurabi. Mesopotamia was not built in an instant. It was a compounded inheritance of thousands of small adaptations layered into civilization. Indus Valley, order from flow. Further east, along the Indus River, another civilization rose quietly, its brilliance revealed only by archaeology. Cities, like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were laid out in grids, with drainage systems that spoke of daily discipline. Farmers compounded knowledge of seasonal flooding into agricultural calendars. Craftsmen repeated pottery designs until they became symbols of culture. Merchants carried goods far beyond the valley, compounding trade into wealth. Though much of its language remains undeciphered, the Indus Valley shows that compounding is not only about monuments, but about order, repetition, and discipline woven into daily life. China. The power of continuity in China, compounding took the form of continuity. From early dynasties like the Shang and Zhou, each generation layered upon the last. Bronze making compounded into artistry and weaponry. Rituals of ancestor worship compounded into Confucian ethics of family and state. Farmers, inventors, and scholars compounded innovations, silk weaving, paper making, the compass, into tools that reshaped the world. Unlike many civilizations that collapsed and disappeared, China's compounded traditions created resilience. Its continuity is proof of the compound effect, steady repetition becoming endurance across millennia. The pattern of Asia's civilizations. Across Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and China, the same rhythm is visible. Water made farming possible. Farming created surplus. Surplus created cities. Cities created culture, laws, and trade. Culture compounded into civilization. Though each region expressed it differently, the underlying law was the same. Small daily acts accumulated across generations built greatness. Echoes beyond. These Asian civilizations did not remain isolated. Their ideas and inventions traveled outward. Writing, trade goods, philosophies. Just as people once migrated from Africa, knowledge now migrated from Asia, compounding human development across continents. Conclusion: the rivers of civilization. The rivers of Mesopotamia, the Indus, and the Yellow River were more than waterways. They were channels of compounding. Drop by drop, season by season, their floods created abundance. That abundance, multiplied, gave birth to cities, laws, and enduring cultures. Asia's first civilizations stand as monuments to the truth. Humanity grows not by leaps, but by layers. The compound effect carved the blueprint of civilization in clay, stone, and silk. Chapter 8. Europe, the layering of ideas. Africa was the primary base and Asia the first flowering of great civilizations. Europe was the laboratory of ideas layered upon those earlier foundations. Its civilizations did not arise in isolation. Greece and Rome, often celebrated as the heart of Western civilization, were themselves compounding inheritances of Africa and Asia. The stones of Egypt, the laws of Mesopotamia, the philosophies of India and China all found echoes and adaptations in Europe. Civilization here was not born suddenly, but layered slowly, thought upon thought, law upon law, empire upon empire. Greece, philosophy and the seed of democracy. The Greeks were heirs before they were innovators. They borrowed mathematics from Egypt, astronomy from Mesopotamia, and myths shaped by older traditions. Yet by layering these inheritances with their own curiosity, they produced something new. Repeated debates in the agora compounded into philosophy, the love of wisdom. Daily civic practices in Athens compounded into democracy, a system of governance rooted in participation. Plays, poems, and myths repeated in theaters compounded into a cultural identity that still influences the world. Greek civilization was compounding at the level of ideas, sharpening, refining, questioning, until thought itself became a tool of civilization. Rome, law, order, and empire. Where Greece questioned, Rome organized. Where Greece philosophized, Rome built. Roads built stone by stone compounded into a network spanning continents. Repeated judgments in courts compounded into Roman law, the foundation of many modern legal systems. Discipline of legions, drilled daily, compounded into an empire that endured for centuries. Rome's genius was not invention alone, but systematization. By compounding order and discipline, it transformed a small city into an empire. The blending of Africa, Asia, and Europe, neither Greece nor Rome stood apart. Greek philosophers studied in Egypt, drawing wisdom from the Nile. Roman trade routes carried goods and ideas from India, Persia, and China. Christianity, born in the Middle East, spread through Rome to shape Europe's soul. Europe was not even an island of genius. It was a crossroads where African, Asian, and local traditions compounded into new forms. The pattern of layering Europe's story reveals a truth. Civilizations are not pure creations, but layered inheritances. Greek thought built on Egyptian science and Mesopotamian myth. Roman law layered upon Greek philosophy and Mediterranean trade. Later, Europe layered upon both Greece and Rome, compounding into medieval kingdoms, Renaissance art, and modern nations. The compound effect here was cultural layering, borrowing, adapting, repeating, refining. Chapter 9. The Firelight Library, Oral Tradition and the Memory of Humanity. Before clay tablets, scrolls, or books, humanity stored its knowledge in breath and voice. Around the fire, in the silence of night, elders spoke and children listened. Stories became vessels of memory, carrying warnings, wisdom, and wonder from one generation to the next. This was humanity's first library, not built of stone, but of repetition. Each story retold was a page, each song sung a shelf, each ritual remembered a binding thread. The fire as teacher. When the day's labor was done and night brought dangers close, fire became more than warmth or protection. It became a gathering, place. Here the first lessons were given: how to hunt, where to find water, which plants were safe, what stars guided the traveler. Every telling compounded memory. A single warning about a poisonous berry, repeated across generations, became law. One man's success in the hunt, told and retold, became legend. The fire was classroom, stage, and sanctuary all at once. The elder as librarian in oral societies, the elder was not just leader, but custodian of memory. They carried in their mind the knowledge of seasons, rituals, and ancestry. Every story told by an elder was an act of preservation, ensuring that the experiences of the past would not be lost with death, but passed on through repetition. Memory was fragile in a single person, but repeated across many voices, it became collective and enduring. From warning to myth, at first, stories were practical. They explained how to survive, which path led to danger, which animal was sacred, which storm meant famine. But over time, repetition added rhythm and meaning. Warnings became myths. Survival tales became cosmologies. A flood story retold became an origin myth. A hero's cleverness retold became cultural identity. A spirit's anger retold became moral law. The compound effect was visible in narrative. What began as caution hardened into culture. Oral tradition as library. Though fragile compared to writing, oral tradition was astonishingly resilient. Entire epics, like the Iliad in Greece or the Mahabharata in India, were preserved for centuries before being written. In Africa, griots carried genealogies of kings across hundreds of years. Repetition made memory durable, just as a song remembered. By one person may be forgotten, but a song sung by a community never dies. So too did oral tradition ensure continuity. Story as survival, oral tradition was not entertainment alone. It was survival. Forgetting which plants cured fever, which paths led to water, or which rituals honored the ancestors could mean death. Memory was medicine, map, and moral code. Thus, storytelling became sacred. To tell was to preserve, to listen was to inherit, to repeat was to live. Conclusion: humanity's first library. The Firelight Library left no shelves, no ink, no monuments. Yet it shaped humanity as surely as pyramids or laws. It shows the compound effect in its purest form. Fragile words, repeated across centuries, becoming the foundation of identity and culture. The Library of Firelight reminds us that memory itself is compounded, and that civilization began not with stone, but with story. Chapter 10. Proverbs. Wisdom in small doses if oral tradition was humanity's first library. Proverbs were its first condensed volumes. They carried entire lessons in a single line, short enough to be remembered, sharp enough to be repeated, deep enough to guide generations. A proverb is a seed. Small, simple, but within it lies a forest of meaning. Spoken often, repeated daily, it compounds into culture. Africa. Little by little, African proverbs often reflect farming, hunting, and communal life. They teach patience, resilience, and interdependence. Little by little, the bird builds its nest. Many drops make a river. Wisdom is like fire, people take it from others. Each saying captures the truth of compounding. Small efforts accumulate, shared wisdom multiplies, patience bears fruit. Asia, drops and journeys. In Asia, proverbs honor constancy and endurance. They show how persistence overcomes strength. Chinese, dripping water wears through stone. Chinese, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Indian, drop by drop is the pot filled. Here, compounding is seen in nature, journeys, and practice. The smallest act, repeated, shapes destiny. Europe, pennies and stones. European proverbs reflect mercantile life and natural imagery. English, take care of the pennies, and the pounds will take care of themselves. Greek, constant dripping wears away the stone. German, small causes can have great effects. For Europe, the compound effect often appears in thrift, caution, and the endurance of effort. The Middle East, patience as wealth in desert cultures, patience and persistence were survival itself. Proverbs reflect that truth. Arabic, drop by drop, a river is made. Persian, with time and patience, the mulberry leaf becomes silk. Bedouin, little by little, the camel goes far. For peoples of the desert, compounding was not abstract. It was the key to survival in harsh landscapes. The universal thread. Though spoken in different tongues and shaped by different lands, these proverbs sing the same song. Small acts matter. Patience multiplies strength. What is repeated transforms. This universality proves that the compound effect is not a cultural invention, but a human recognition of the law written into life itself. Conclusion: wisdom carried in one line of proverb is the world's most efficient teacher. It condenses centuries into a sentence. Its repetition ensures survival of wisdom across generations. Proverbs remind us that the compound effect is not only lived, but spoken, not only practiced, but remembered. They are humanity's way of carrying eternity in a breath. Chapter 11. Art and Symbol. Humanity's compounded imagination. Civilizations rise not only on stone and law, but on imagination. Humanity's power has always been the ability to see more than what is in front of us, to give shape to the unseen, to clothe memory and image to make the invisible visible. Art and symbol were the earliest expressions of this gift. What began as simple marks on cave walls, beats on a drum, or shapes carved in stone compounded over centuries into religions, flags, and nations. Imagination, repeated and refined, became the glue of identity. The first marks in caves from southern Africa to Lascaux in France. Early humans painted animals, hunters, and symbols. These were not idle decorations. They were acts of memory, of magic, of meaning. A single handprint on a wall, repeated, became a gallery of belonging. A single animal drawn, repeated, became ritual for the hunt. A symbol scratched, repeated, became a code of communication. Each mark was fragile, but repeated across walls, generations, and regions, they compounded into traditions of art. Rhythm and dance before instruments. There was rhythm, sticks against stone, hands against skin. Before written language, there was dance, bodies moving in repetition, telling stories without words. The drumbeat repeated became heartbeat of the village. The circle dance repeated became ritual of community. Songs, sung together night after night, became the binding rope of identity. Music and dance were compounding at work in sound and movement. What began as instinct grew into cultural treasure, symbols of power and faith. As societies grew, art and symbol became tools of power and belief. A crown, worn repeatedly, became the mark of kingship. A cross drawn and carried became the mark of faith. A flag waved again and again became the mark of a nation. Symbols condensed vast meaning into single images. Their repetition compounded their power until people were willing to live and die beneath them. The compounding of imagination. Imagination was not one leap of genius, but compounding practice. One carving led to sculpture. One melody led to music. One myth led to theology. Humanities. Ability to imagine when repeated across time became culture itself. Art was not decoration. It was destiny, the compounding of creativity into civilization's heartbeat. Conclusion: the invisible made visible. Through art and symbol, humanity learned to give permanence to the invisible. What could not be held, memory, faith, identity, was painted, sung, danced, and carved into being. This was imagination compounded, fragile gestures multiplied into monuments of meaning. It reminds us that civilization is not only built of matter, but of mind, and that the imagination, once repeated, can move nations as surely as armies. Chapter 12. Builders of Time. Calendars, clocks, and the compounding of order civilization cannot exist without time. To plant, to build, to govern, to worship, all require rhythm and order. From the earliest farmers watching the stars to the monks ringing bells in medieval cloisters, humanity has sought to measure the passing of hours, days, and seasons. Time, once wild and unmarked, was captured, divided, and repeated. In this act of mastery, civilizations multiplied their strength. The compound effect was at work again. Each small observation of the heavens, repeated and recorded, compounded into calendars, clocks, and the disciplined order of society. Watching the sky at first, humans measured time by nature itself. The sun's rising and setting divided day from night. The moon's phases marked cycles of fertility and harvest. The stars revealed seasons, guiding migrations and plantings. These observations were fragile, dependent on memory. But when repeated, they became patterns. Patterns became calendars. Calendars became civilization's first invisible architecture. Calendars, the rhythm of society agriculture, demanded order. A missed season meant famine. Thus, early societies turned to calendars. In Egypt, the flooding of the Nile was predicted by observing Sirius, the brightest star. This compounded into a solar calendar that aligned farming with the river's rhythm. In Mesopotamia, priests charted the movements of planets and moons, compounding astronomy into detailed lunar calendars. In Mesoamerica, the Maya developed interlocking calendars for farming, ritual, and prophecy, proving that time itself could be woven into culture. Calendars gave predictability. They transformed survival into stability, and stability into growth. Clocks. Capturing the hour as societies grew, they required not only seasons, but hours. Temples, courts, and markets demanded coordination. Thus, clocks emerged. Sundials marked shadows, turning sunlight into schedule. Water clocks measured the steady drip, drip, drip of time. Later, mechanical clocks multiplied precision, dividing hours into minutes, minutes into seconds. Each refinement compounded humanity's control over time. The world could now be ordered not only by season, but by hour. Time and discipline. Once measured, time became a tool of discipline. Bells summoned monks to prayer at regular intervals, compounding faith into routine. Clocks in city squares synchronized work and trade, compounding cooperation. Factories of the industrial age divided labor into shifts, compounding production. Time, once free, became harnessed. Repetition turned into rhythm, rhythm into order, order into progress. The invisible architecture. Unlike pyramids or cathedrals, calendars and clocks leave no grand monuments. Yet they are civilization's invisible architecture. They bind together millions of people who never meet by aligning their actions in shared rhythm. Time, once chaotic, became the framework upon which law, trade, and culture could expand. Conclusion: time as civilization's compound to master time is to multiply possibility. Calendars turned survival into civilization. Clocks turned chaos into coordination. Bells, shadows, and stars became the instruments of order. The compound effect here is profound. Small observations of nature, repeated and recorded, compounded into the great schedules of humanity. Civilization itself became a clockwork, measured, ordered, enduring. Chapter 13: Alphabets and Archives. Writing as humanity's memory machine. If calendars and clocks gave civilizations order in time, writing gave them order in memory. Spoken. Words fade, but written marks endure. The first scratches on clay, the first carvings on stone, the first brushstrokes on papyrus. All were fragile beginnings. Yet with repetition and refinement, these marks compounded into alphabets, archives, and libraries. Writing became humanity's external memory, multiplying knowledge far beyond the limits of individual minds. The first marks, the earliest writing, was practical. In Mesopotamia, clay tokens marked livestock and grain. Repeated, these symbols became cuneiform. In Egypt, pictorial hieroglyphs recorded rituals, kings, and commerce. In China, oracle bones bore the earliest characters, compounding divination into script. At first, writing served accountants and priests, but repeated across centuries, it became the foundation of culture. Alphabets, efficiency-compounded pictographs, were powerful but limited. They required thousands of symbols. Over time, efficiency compounded. The Phoenicians reduced writing to a set of consonantal signs, the first alphabet. The Greeks added vowels, compounding clarity. The Romans spread the Latin alphabet, whose descendants fill today's books and screens. An alphabet is the compound effect made visible, from many complex signs to a small set of repeatable symbols, capable of infinite expression. Archives, memory. Stored writing created archives, memory stored outside the body. Clay tablets, scrolls, inscriptions, and codices multiplied across civilizations. In Mesopotamia, the library of Ashurbanipal gathered thousands of clay tablets. In Egypt, papyrus. Scrolls recorded wisdom, hymns, and administration. In Greece and Rome, libraries became sanctuaries of accumulated knowledge. Each archive was a compounding of memory, one record fragile, many records enduring, together forming the backbone of continuity. Libraries, civilization's memory. Banks' libraries became humanity's collective brain. The Library of Alexandria, though later destroyed, symbolized this dream, to gather the world's knowledge in one place. Monastic libraries in medieval Europe, scriptoria in Ethiopia, and temple collections in Asia preserved memory when empires fell. Without writing and libraries, knowledge would vanish with each generation. With them, it compounded each scholar, adding to the last, each text building on earlier words. Writing and power writing was not neutral. It gave power to those who controlled it. Laws carved in stone-bound societies with permanence. Sacred texts, copied and recited, shaped civilizations, beliefs. Contracts, treaties, and charters formalized authority. Words, once fleeting, became binding. Power itself was compounded by writing. Conclusion: Memory beyond flesh alphabets and archives allowed humanity to escape the limits of memory. No longer bound to the fragile minds of elders, wisdom could be carried across centuries and continents. Writing was not invention alone, it was compounding made flesh. Small marks repeated until they held the weight of civilizations. The pen, it is said, is mightier than the sword. Why? Because swords cut once, but writing, repeated, multiplies forever. Chapter 14. Institutions, the compounding of authority and knowledge civilizations, are not held together by stone alone, but by structures of trust, authority, and continuity. Institutions are those structures. They are the repeated practices of people made permanent. A single priest performing a ritual is fragile. A temple staffed by generations of priests becomes enduring. A single judgment in a dispute may be forgotten. A court that repeats judgments becomes law. Institutions are the compound effect of human behavior, hardened into frameworks that outlast individuals. Temples, ritual, compounded into sacred order. Religion was among the earliest institutions. Temples were not merely buildings, but rhythms of ritual made permanent. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose as centers of repeated offerings and prayers. In Egypt, temples preserved rituals of the gods, conducted daily across centuries. In Mesoamerica, pyramids served as sacred stages for rites performed again and again. The power of temples lay not in a single ceremony, but in the daily repetition of ritual. Each prayer, each offering, compounded into a continuity of faith. Courts. Justice. Compounded into law. Every community has disputes. At first, elders judged by memory and custom. But as societies grew, judgments repeated became law, and law became institution. The Code of Hammurabi was not the invention of justice, but the codification of repeated judgments. Roman law, built case by case, compounded into a system that still influences modern courts. In Africa, councils of elders turned oral customs into enduring structures of authority. Institutions of justice transformed fragile settlements into ordered societies. Schools. Knowledge compounded into tradition. Education, too, began in repetition. Parents taught children skills of farming, hunting, or trade. But when teaching became formalized, schools were born. In ancient China, Confucian academies compounded ethics into statecraft. In Greece, Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum became enduring models of inquiry. In medieval Africa, centers like Timbuktu's Sankore University preserved and multiplied scholarship. Schools compounded knowledge. One lesson became curriculum, one teacher's wisdom became tradition. Institutions. As memory beyond generations, the strength of institutions lies in continuity. Individuals die, institutions endure. Each generation of priests, judges, or teachers adds a layer. The compound effect multiplies authority and knowledge across centuries. Temples preserved rituals long after their founders vanished. Courts maintained justice beyond the lives of their first judges. Schools carried wisdom forward, ensuring no lesson was lost with death. Institutions are civilization's scaffolding, invisible yet indispensable. The double edge of institutions. The compound effect is neutral. It magnifies both virtue and vice. Institutions, too, can ossify. Temples sometimes fossilized into superstition. Courts sometimes hardened into injustice. Schools sometimes froze into dogma. But even in failure, institutions proved the power of repetition. Whatever is repeated, whether wise or corrupt, becomes enduring. Chapter 15. Habits. The architecture of the mind civilizations are built of stone and story. Lives are built of habits. What we do once may pass unnoticed, but what we do every day builds the architecture of the mind, the framework of character, and the shape of destiny. Habits are the compound effect turned inward, repeated acts that multiply until they become who we are. The nature of habits a habit is a repeated act so ingrained that it requires little thought. It begins fragile, a choice made once, then again. But repetition hardens it until it becomes second nature. Reading a page each night becomes a lifetime of learning. Saving a coin each day becomes security. Smoking one cigarette each evening becomes disease. Habits are the invisible builders of the self, the neutral law. The compound effect is impartial. It magnifies what is given to it. Good habits multiply health, wisdom, and strength. Bad habits multiply weakness, ignorance, and despair. Exercise, repeated, compounds into resilience. Neglect, repeated, compounds into frailty. Gratitude, repeated, compounds into joy. Complaint, repeated, compounds into bitterness. The law does not choose sides. It simply multiplies. The psychology of habit modern science confirms what ancient wisdom taught. Habits shape the brain itself. Neural pathways strengthen with repetition. Each act lays down a track, and repeated acts become highways. The brain conserves energy by turning choices into automatic routines. This is why change is difficult. To break a bad habit is not to erase a single choice. It is to dismantle an entire neural architecture built over time. But it also means building good habits compounds into strength at the deepest level of the mind. The small beginnings, great habits rarely begin as great. They begin as small, almost invisible choices. 5 minutes of prayer, a short daily walk, writing a paragraph, listening without interrupting. Alone, each seems insignificant. But compounded over years, they become character, health, wisdom, and trust, the chains of neglect. The same law explains decline. Missing 1 day of practice compounds into laziness. 1 lie compounds into deceit. 1 indulgence compounds into addiction. As Warren Buffett said of reputation, it takes 20 years to build and 5 minutes to ruin. Habits build slowly but break swiftly if neglected. The architecture of destiny habits are the blueprints of the future. What you repeat is what you become. As Aristotle observed, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Every life is a cathedral under construction. Each day's habits are the stones laid. Over time, they shape the structure, beautiful or broken. Conclusion: the daily builder's habits are the compound effect in its most personal form. They are the architects of the mind, the builders of character, the sculptors of destiny. Each choice is a stone. Each repetition is a wall. Each habit is a tower reaching into the future. The question is never if your habits will shape you. The only question is how. Chapter 16. The compound effect in relationships. Love, trust, and loyalty. Built, daily human beings are not solitary creatures. We live in webs of family, friendship, and community. Yet these bonds are not forged by grand gestures alone. They are built, sustained, or broken by small daily acts. Relationships, like civilizations, are the harvest of compounding. The reservoir of trust is not given all at once. It is earned drop by drop. A promise kept adds a drop. A secret honored adds a drop. A kindness remembered adds a drop. Over time, these drops fill the reservoir of trust. But one betrayal, one repeated neglect can drain it quickly. The compound effect works both ways. Faithfulness compounds into loyalty, while dishonesty compounds into suspicion. Love is daily practice. Love is often spoken of as a feeling, but it survives as a practice. A gentle word at the end of a hard day. A meal prepared with care. A hand held in silence. None of these acts are dramatic, yet repeated. They compound into intimacy. Romance may flare in moments, but true love grows in daily devotion, the cost of neglect. Just as kindness compounds, so too does neglect. Silence repeated becomes distance. Criticism repeated becomes resentment. Indifference repeated becomes estrangement. Few relationships collapse in a single moment. Most are undone by the compound effect of daily neglect. Friendship, the small. Threads friendship is woven not in rare occasions, but in small threads. Shared laughter, regular visits, remembered birthdays, quiet support in hard times. A friendship neglected unravels. A friendship nourished compounds into lifelong loyalty. Communities. Compounding care. Communities thrive when members invest daily in one another. A neighbor who greets you each morning. A shared meal during festivals. A village that gathers. To repair a roof. Small acts of solidarity, multiplied, become culture. Communities that neglect such practices decay into isolation and distrust. The law in human bonds. The law of compounding is impartial. It will magnify whatever is repeated. Care repeated becomes loyalty. Neglect repeated becomes bitterness. Respect repeated becomes peace. Violence repeated becomes cycles of revenge. Every relationship is a garden. Daily care compounds into fruitfulness. Daily neglect compounds into weeds. Conclusion: love built brick by brick relationships are not built in grand declarations, but in steady practices. Love, trust, and loyalty are the result of compounded moments. Words spoken, promises kept, kindness repeated. The compound effect reminds us that in human bonds, nothing is small. Every act adds to the structure. Every moment shapes the future. Every choice compounds into intimacy or estrangement. In the end, the question is simple. What are you multiplying in your relationships today? Chapter 17. The Compound Effect in Nima. Spirit. Small practices that shape eternity. The deepest compounding is not in wealth or empires, but in the soul. Spirit grows in silence, in repetition, in daily practices that may seem small, yet reach into eternity. Prayer whispered in the morning, gratitude spoken at night, a moment of stillness amid chaos. Such things seem fragile, but when compounded, they shape the eternal architecture of the human heart. The hidden growth. Spiritual practices often feel invisible. A single prayer may seem unheard. A single meditation may feel empty. A single act of service may look insignificant. But compounding assures us that repetition transforms. A prayer said daily compounds into peace of mind. A moment of silence, compounded across years, becomes clarity of soul. A daily act of kindness compounds into a life of compassion. What is unseen today becomes unshakable tomorrow. Faithfulness. Overfeeling spiritual growth is not sustained by occasional ecstasy, but by daily faithfulness. The monk who chants every sunrise, the elder who lights the same candle each evening, the believer who keeps gratitude even in sorrow. Each act alone may feel ordinary, but repeated, they compound into strength that endures storms. Gratitude. The multiplying virtue gratitude is perhaps the clearest spiritual compounder. One thankful thought softens a heart. One daily thanksgiving reshapes perception. Over years, gratitude compounds into joy, an inner wealth independent of circumstances. Service. Drops into river service too compounds. One meal given to the hungry, one visit to the lonely, one act of forgiveness to an enemy. Each is a drop, but together they form rivers of mercy. Whole movements of compassion begin with the compounding of unnoticed acts, the eternal perspective. The compound effect. In spirit stretches beyond life itself. Faith traditions across the world speak of eternal reward. Buddhism, daily mindfulness compounding into enlightenment. Hinduism, karma compounding across lifetimes. Christianity, faith and works compounding into eternal life. Baha'i and New Thought, steady alignment compounding into a world transformed. The message is shared. What is done faithfully, however small, echoes into eternity. Conclusion. Eternity in a seed. The spirit grows like a seed. Buried, unseen, watered daily, it slowly sends roots and branches until one day it becomes a tree. The compound effect is not only a law of nature and history, but of the eternal soul. Each small practice, prayer, gratitude, silence, service, compounds into character that death cannot erase. The soul is shaped not by what is done once, but by what is done always. In this, the law of compounding reveals its final truth. The eternal is built daily. Africa is the birthplace of all mankind. People migrated from Africa outwards to other regions of the world. In their new regions, they formulated civilizations that helped them adapt to their world. But now civilization has come full circle to where mankind began, Africa.